Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode in our continuing exploration of the Hughes, Hubbard & Reed 2024 FCPA and Anti-Bribery Alert. Today, I'm thrilled to have with me Daniel McLaughlin. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for having me here. Really thrilled to be here.
So, as I've said to your colleagues on our prior recordings, this is one of my favorite alerts for a couple of different reasons. One is you're first. So when you're the first to release the annual alert, it gets a lot of draw, and certainly releasing it in the end of 2024 really gives it to someone like me a great ability to look back, but also how you really look at lessons learned. And I wanted to focus on that from you. I wanted to maybe start with what are some two or three of the biggest lessons learned you saw from 2024 that Hughes Hubbard reported in the alert?
Thanks again for that introduction. I'd say one of the biggest lessons that came out of 2024 is not a new lesson. It's one that's been repeated almost every year, but a lot of companies just fail to take it on board. And that's the use of third-party agents for their business development practices. And for people who maybe don't know what a third-party agent is, it's essentially someone who's not you or the customer you're working with, so neither of the two parties, but a third party that's helping you win or retain business or do something else, obtain licenses, something that you need to do to operate in the countries. And there's great risk in working with these third party agents because everyone knows you're not allowed to bribe people. But beyond that, the people that you hire, that you engage on your behalf to work for you, are not allowed to make improper payments either. And if they do, even without your specific knowledge, you could still be held liable for that if you should have known that they would have engaged in such activities. And so the key lesson here is working with companies where you fail to conduct the proper due diligence. And we can get into that a little bit later and what it means, but that's probably one of the biggest lessons that we see recurring year after year. The second one, I think, is a relatively newer one because it plays on a new DOJ policy, the FCPA Safe Harbor policy, which applies to mergers and acquisitions. And when a company acquires another company, they don't always have the ability to conduct full due diligence before the deal closes to ascertain what the bribery risks are, what the corruption risks are, etc. But in the past year or two, the DOJ has come out with this new policy, which allows companies, if they discover improper behavior, either during their preliminary pre-acquisition due diligence or during post-acquisition due diligence, when they have more of ability to really dive into the details, to self-report that to the DOJ and basically to get what we call a declination letter, that the DOJ won't hold them accountable for the conduct that they discovered. And it basically is a way to encourage companies that have solid compliance programs to acquire companies that maybe don't and bring them into the fold, into the compliance family, so to speak. And then the third one we see is the DOJ continuing to focus on WhatsApp and ephemeral messaging systems and what that means for corporate resolutions going forward.
Daniel, I'd like to start with the third parties because I saw a presentation in April of this year where the presenter said in 2001, 100% of all FCPA enforcement actions involve third parties. In 2023, 100% of all FCPA enforcement actions involve third parties. It is still the highest risk. And how do you help counsel a client around the part of third parties, which is up to the point the contract sign, i.e. the due diligence? How can you perform effective due diligence? And then how can you evaluate that? Or is it more art than science?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, you have to have the right way to go about it, and you need the right people to help you go about it. But essentially, there's a number of questions that you need to ask yourself when you're engaging a third party. And look, this whole process is risk-based. Some parties are going to present higher risks than others, either due to the nature of the services they're providing or where they're providing those services or their background, etc. You don't have to do a full massive due diligence of every single third party. Ones that present lower risk, you can take a proportionate approach. But in general, for the third party sales agents that present more significant risk, there's always, I'd say, 5 or 6 key questions that you need to ask. And you have to really make sure that you understand what the answers are to these questions. Because sometimes you'll get answers, but they won't necessarily make any sense if you stop and think about them. And so that's really the key, is to sit back and assess what you've been able to gather through this process. And so the first question I always ask is, why do we even need a third party agent at all? And so there has to be some sort of justification as to why we need to have someone come in here and help us that the company can't do on its own. And second, if we have established that, okay, there is a need, why this third party? What are their qualifications? What are their experiences? What do they bring to the table that's so special that we want to engage them to assist us, as opposed to others who could help us? And then the third, we have to really make sure we understand who they are. And that goes particularly for who are the ultimate beneficial owners of these companies. Because a lot of times, what companies like this will do is they'll have nominee shareholders, either official nominees through a bank that holds it on their behalf, or through a nominee shareholding structure, or just people who are inserted into the shareholding who are listed as the official owners, but who aren't listed as the real owners because they don't want to draw that attention to themselves. Perhaps sometimes for legitimate reasons, but a lot of times so to distance themselves, to not draw attention to the fact that connections that they may have to the relevant government officials or other decision makers who are involved in the deals. So third, beyond that, or fourth, then, after we have those questions, how is this business partner being paid? How are we paying them? How much are we paying them? Is it commensurate for the services that they're providing? And that leads us to question 5, which is, what actually are they going to do for us? There has to be very clearly defined services. The services have to make sense. And we have to make sure that they're actually doing those services. And that goes to not so much a question, but just a follow-up point, that you have to really follow up beyond the contract signature. Assess, review activity reports, make sure they're doing all the work that they're supposed to be doing, and that all the payments are going through consistent with what the contract says. Because what a lot of times you'll see in settlements, and we've seen this in a lot of cases in 2024, you'll have companies that are engaging people that actually don't do any legitimate services. Now, the compliance department, the ethics and compliance departments, they may not necessarily know that going into it, if someone is trying to engage someone for an improper service. But this is where the compliance program really needs to be able to step in and say, okay, now we have to assess what exactly are they doing, and make sure that makes sense in terms of the overall program.
Daniel, in addition to this retrospective look back, I wanted to really ask you, or maybe get your thoughts on the following. Whatever the enforcement regime in the new administration will be, I've told people that sanctions will be robust, and there will probably be additional sanctions. Obviously, there are countries that are on certain sanctioned lists, but there are individuals from those countries, or even within regions within those countries, such as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in Zhejiang province. And so it seems to me that the point you have raised on ultimate beneficial owners, knowing who you're doing business with, will be even more important, if that's possible, going forward. And I really wanted to get your thoughts on how compliance needs to end. This will be or could well be a prime.
It's a great point. And the question about ultimate beneficial ownership is relevant for many different questions and many different types of enforcement actions that could come in, including not anti-bribery, the sanctions, etc. There's more beyond that. I mean, it's about developing a culture to make you understand how important this is. And it has to do with training. It has to do with stepping in to not only just say no, but to sort of offer ways forward for the sales teams that are looking for ways to succeed. I think a lot of times compliance has the reputation of which is not what anyone in this business wants to do. And certainly the part you have to do to go beyond that is not just say no to something, but also to find the alternatives to help them get to where they need to be. And I think that's a big part of it, to help them understanding the importance is really bringing them in and saying, look, we're working together to try to find the best way forward, not only to win the business, but to protect the company.
Daniel, there's one other lesson learned I wanted to raise that was listed in this year's alert. And once again, it's almost back to the future of gifts and entertainment. Those are traditionally seen as low-hanging fruit. That is something your compliance program should and could deal with on a risk basis early on. The rules were set by the DOJ in the first decade of this year, and yet over this past year, we saw multiple enforcement actions involving just that. So I was wondering if you could maybe comment on that, and did we really have to go back to the future? And should compliance officers maybe reevaluate their own gifts, entertainment, and travel programs in light of what we saw in force in 2024?
Yeah, no, it's really quite surprising, I think, because a lot of times you see things like this and you say, this is how it was done decades ago. The schemes are supposed to be more evolved by now. They're supposed to be more clever criminals and ways of doing bribes, but it's not always the case. I mean, and you've seen there were some cases this year where people were exchanging messages about handing off envelopes of cash. So it's, as you say, it's really these past practices coming back. Of course, there are more sophisticated ways as well, but the old ways die hard. And the gifts and hospitality is one that we see coming back. And why does it stay around? Because people love the gifts and they love the hospitality. And you have these individuals who are maybe not in the most high-paying positions, but have responsibility for awarding these projects, and they're being offered these lavish gifts, trips to massage parlors in Thailand, or gifts of cars. I mean, it gets quite scandalous, but how do you go about doing it? The policies themselves are not always the problem. You could have a policy that on paper is perfectly fine. And in some of the cases that we've seen, this was true, where there were rules about how requests for gifts and hospitality should be made. They just weren't followed. So it's not a question of updating the reporting guidelines or the thresholds or anything like that, but having some way to monitor and to make sure that the programs are working as you anticipate. And in light of what we see this year, I think it's definitely something that companies should be thinking about going in this year, even if they have what they consider to be a relatively good and robust gifts and hospitality program. If they haven't running searches over collecting certain emails and looking, all right, are the gifts that people are actually providing consistent with what they're being reported? Running audits like that, I think, can be very illuminating and can highlight the risk areas you might have that you need to shore up a little further.
Daniel, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to review the 2024 FCPA alert, or even maybe sign up for a hard copy, because that's equally cool as well, to get the hard copy of this document, because it's a reference tool for the entire year. Where can they go?
If they want to be that cool, and you will be the coolest kid on the block, you just go to our website, so hugheshubbard.com. You'll find it there. It's prominently featured. You can download the PDF version, or as you said, sign up for the print copy, and we'll be happy to send one your way.
Daniel, I wanted to thank you again, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Thank you, sir.